If you had met me 2 years ago, you would have called me lucky. I was 53 years old, happily married for 28 years, living in the house my husband and I had built together from nothing but determination and impossible dreams. My name is Claire Bennett, and for most of my adult life, I believed loyalty was something that protected you. I believed if you loved deeply enough, sacrificed quietly enough, and stayed faithful through every storm, life would eventually reward you with peace. I was wrong. Looking back now, I don't think my marriage collapsed in a single day. It died one unnoticed compromise at a time, one unanswered question after another, one lie disguised as kindness until the truth became impossible to recognize. Ethan and I met when we were both in our 20s. He was ambitious, charming, and convinced he would someday own a successful construction company. I was working as an elementary school librarian, earning just enough to pay rent and student loans. We were never wealthy in those early years. We counted every dollar, postponed vacations, repaired old furniture instead of buying new pieces, and celebrated anniversaries with homemade dinners because restaurants felt like unnecessary luxuries. None of that mattered to me because every night Ethan looked at me as if I were the best decision he had ever made. That look became my definition of home. As the years passed, his business flourished beyond anything either of us had imagined. Our modest house became a beautiful two-story home surrounded by maple trees. We hosted Thanksgiving every year. We welcomed neighbors with backyard barbecues every summer. Friends often joked that we were the couple everyone secretly hoped to become. They never saw the parts that happened behind closed doors, because neither did I. The first changes were so ordinary, they barely deserved attention. Ethan started traveling more often for work. He spent longer hours at the office. His phone was suddenly protected by a password after years of leaving it on the kitchen counter without a second thought. Whenever I entered the room, he instinctively turned the screen away from me. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every excuse seemed believable. Success demanded sacrifices, didn't it? That was what I kept telling myself. Then came the forgotten moments. Our anniversary dinner postponed because of an unexpected meeting. A weekend getaway canceled at the last minute. Birthdays celebrated with expensive gifts instead of genuine attention. Somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped giving me his time and started replacing it with things money could buy. I accepted every substitute because I convinced myself it was temporary. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was putting away his dry cleaning when I noticed a receipt tucked inside his jacket pocket. It wasn't the amount that caught my attention, it was the location. A luxury boutique hotel less than 15 miles from our home. Ethan had told me he spent that afternoon meeting investors in another city nearly 2 hours away. I stood in our bedroom holding that small piece of paper while my heart tried desperately to invent an innocent explanation before my mind could reach the obvious one. I placed the receipt back exactly where I found it. I never mentioned it. Not because I trusted him completely, but because I was terrified of discovering I couldn't. Days turned into weeks. Ethan became increasingly distracted, speaking to me with polite kindness instead of genuine affection. He kissed my forehead instead of my lips. He asked whether I needed groceries but never asked how I was feeling. We were still living in the same house, yet somehow existing in different worlds. The only person who seemed to notice before I did was his father, Walter Bennett. Walter had spent 40 years running a small hardware store before retiring. He believed integrity mattered more than wealth and often reminded his grandchildren that character was measured by what people did when nobody was watching. Every Sunday afternoon, I visited him with fresh soup or homemade pie. One afternoon, as we played a quiet game of chess, he suddenly looked at me and asked, "Claire, has Ethan been treating you the way a husband should?" The question startled me so much that I accidentally knocked over my queen. I laughed awkwardly and said everything was fine, but Walter didn't smile. He simply studied my face with the calm patience of a man who had spent a lifetime recognizing uncomfortable truths. "A person doesn't lose that sparkle in their eyes without a reason," he said softly. "Just remember, you deserve honesty, even when honesty hurts." His words followed me all the way home. That evening, Ethan arrived after 9 carrying an expensive bottle of wine and apologizing for another delayed dinner. He smiled, hugged me briefly, and headed upstairs to shower. As he disappeared into the bathroom, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I wasn't planning to touch it, but the screen lit up before my eyes. The message preview contained only 7 words. I can't wait until she's finally gone. My blood ran cold. There was no name, only an unfamiliar number. I stared at those 7 words while the sound of running water echoed from upstairs. My hands began trembling so violently I had to grip the edge of the counter to remain standing. Gone. They weren't talking about a business deal. They weren't discussing a client. Deep inside, before I had a single piece of proof, I already knew exactly who she was. And for the first time in 28 years of marriage, I realized I might not know the man sleeping beside me at all. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at those 7 words until the screen went dark. My first instinct was to unlock Ethan's phone, but I stopped myself. 28 years of marriage had taught me that once you cross certain lines, there was no walking back. If I was about to discover that my husband had betrayed me, I wanted the truth to come from him, not from stolen messages that would haunt me forever. I put the phone back exactly where it had been just as the shower upstairs stopped running. A few moments later, Ethan came downstairs wearing sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, looking so familiar that it almost made me question what I had seen. He smiled, poured himself a glass of wine, and kissed my cheek. "You look tired," he said. I searched his face for guilt, for nervousness, for anything that suggested the man standing in front of me had just received a message about wanting me gone. Instead, he looked completely at ease. That frightened me more than anything. "Long day," I answered. "You?" "The usual," he said with a shrug. "Too many meetings." The lie came so naturally that he barely paused between words. We sat down for dinner, and for nearly 20 minutes he talked about supply shortages, difficult clients, and a new commercial project. I realized something chilling. He had become remarkably good at pretending. Every smile was perfectly timed. Every laugh sounded genuine. Every casual question about my day was delivered by a man who had apparently learned to separate his secret life from the one we had built together. When dinner ended, he offered to load the dishwasher. 20 years ago, that gesture would have warmed my heart. That night, it felt like watching an actor perform a role he no longer believed in. I barely slept. Every time Ethan shifted beside me, I wondered whether he was dreaming about another woman. Every time he reached toward me unconsciously in his sleep, I resisted the urge to pull away. By sunrise, I had made one decision. I would not accuse him until I had undeniable proof. If my marriage truly was ending, I refused to let him manipulate the story or convince me that I had imagined everything. The following morning, Ethan left early, claiming he had an important breakfast meeting with investors. 30 minutes later, I called his office under the pretense of confirming his lunch schedule. His assistant sounded confused. "Mr. Bennett isn't expected in today," she said politely. "He's taking a personal day." My heart dropped. I thanked her, hung up, and stared out the living room window for several minutes. It was no longer suspicion. It was deception. I grabbed my purse, started my car, and drove toward the boutique hotel listed on the receipt I had found days earlier. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I hoped I would discover another explanation. Maybe I wanted fate to prove me wrong. Instead, I arrived just in time to watch Ethan step out of the hotel lobby with a young blonde woman holding his hand. She couldn't have been older than 30. She was laughing at something he had said, and then, right there on the sidewalk where anyone could see them, he leaned over and kissed her. Not a polite greeting, not a friendly embrace, the kind of kiss reserved for people planning a future together. My future ended in that parking lot. I don't remember crying. I don't remember breathing. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb while the man I had loved for more than half my life opened the passenger door of his SUV for someone else with the same gentlemanly smile he used to reserve for me. I waited until they drove away before I realized I had been holding my breath. Somehow I managed to get home without causing an accident. I walked through my front door like a stranger entering someone else's house. Every photograph on the walls suddenly looked like evidence from a crime scene. Every anniversary picture captured promises that apparently meant nothing to the only other person in them. Around noon, my daughter, Megan, called to ask whether I wanted to have lunch later that week. I almost told her everything. Instead, I heard myself say, "I'd love that." Mothers spend so much of their lives protecting their children that sometimes we forget we are allowed to fall apart ourselves. After hanging up, I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror. I studied the woman looking back at me. There were silver strands in my hair now, fine lines around my eyes, the face of someone who had laughed often, worried deeply, and loved completely. For one dangerous moment, I wondered if Ethan had left because I had grown older. Then I remembered something Walter had once told me. Character reveals itself when temptation becomes easier than gratitude. This wasn't about my age. It wasn't about wrinkles or gray hair. It was about choices. Ethan had chosen excitement over loyalty, secrecy over honesty, and convenience over commitment. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Walter. "Claire," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Of course." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Has Ethan asked you for a divorce yet?" My heart nearly stopped. How? How do you know that word?" Walter let out a slow breath that sounded heavy with disappointment. "Because he came to see me this morning." And what he told me next changed everything I thought I knew about my own son. Walter's question echoed in my ears long after he stopped speaking. "Has Ethan asked you for a divorce yet?" I lowered myself onto the living room sofa because my knees suddenly felt too weak to hold me. "Yes," I answered quietly. "This morning." There was no surprise in Walter's voice, only a deep sadness. "Then he told you before I had the chance to warn you." I closed my eyes. "Warn me about what?" Walter was silent for several seconds, as though carefully choosing every word. "Claire, I asked Ethan to come see me because I noticed things weren't right months ago. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted him to tell me I was imagining everything." My fingers tightened around the phone. Instead? Instead, he admitted he had been seeing another woman. Hearing Walter say it aloud somehow hurt even more than watching Ethan kiss her outside the hotel. It was no longer suspicion. It was no longer something I had witnessed alone. It was now a fact acknowledged by the two people who knew my husband better than anyone. "He told me he was in love," Walter continued. "He said he deserved another chance at happiness." I laughed bitterly. "At the expense of mine." That's exactly what I told him. Walter's normally calm voice carried unmistakable disappointment. I asked him whether he had considered what 28 years of loyalty meant. He said people change. I stared at the framed family portrait sitting on the coffee table. Ethan's arm was wrapped around my shoulders, and both of us were smiling as though nothing could ever separate us. "Did he mention me at all?" I whispered. Walter answered immediately, only to say that you would eventually understand. My heart sank. Understand? Understand that I had become an obstacle standing between him and his new life? Understand that the vows we exchanged had somehow expired without my knowledge? Walter interrupted my thoughts. "Claire, I need you to listen carefully." His tone changed from sympathetic to deliberate. "Do not sign anything quickly." I frowned. "He already mentioned selling the house." "I'm sure he did." Walter let out a slow breath. "Has he shown you any financial documents?" "No." "Has he discussed the business?" "Not yet." Another pause. "Then he isn't telling you everything." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Walter hesitated. "For years, I've watched Ethan make decisions that became increasingly secretive. I trusted him because he was my son. Now I'm beginning to question whether I should have." Before I could ask another question, he surprised me. "Would you be willing to come over this evening?" "Of course. There are some papers I think you should see." "What kind of papers?" "Not over the phone." His answer was gentle but firm. "Just promise me you won't tell Ethan we're meeting." After we hung up, I sat in complete silence. The house felt different now. Not because anything had physically changed, but because every familiar room suddenly seemed filled with hidden truths. Ethan had lied. Walter knew more than he was saying. And somewhere between those two realities was a secret large enough to make an 80-year-old father lose faith in his own son. Around 6 that evening, I drove to Walter's house. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he had been watching for my car. Without saying a word, he led me into his study, closed the door, and walked toward an old oak desk I had seen hundreds of times but never paid much attention to. From the bottom drawer, he removed a thick manila envelope secured with a rubber band. He placed it on the desk between us but didn't immediately hand it over. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes. "Claire, before you open this, I need you to answer one question honestly." I nodded. "If you discover that Ethan has lied about more than just another woman, if you discover your marriage wasn't the only thing he kept from you, are you prepared to know the truth?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know if anyone is ever prepared." Walter slowly pushed the envelope toward me. My hands trembled as I removed the rubber band and opened the flap. Inside were photocopies of bank statements, corporate filings, property records, and several documents bearing Ethan's signature. At first, they meant nothing. Then one page caught my attention. It listed the ownership structure of Bennett Construction. My eyes moved down the page until they reached the percentage beside Ethan's name. It wasn't 100%. It wasn't even close. Confused, I looked back at Walter. "This can't be right," I whispered. "Ethan always told me he owned the company outright." Walter's expression remained painfully calm. "That's exactly what he wanted everyone to believe." I looked back at the document, my heart pounding harder with every passing second. There, beside another ownership percentage, was a name I had never expected to see. It wasn't a business partner. It wasn't an investor. It wasn't even a relative. It was Vanessa. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the name. Vanessa. It felt impossible that 7 letters could erase nearly 3 decades of certainty. I looked up at Walter, convinced there had to be some explanation, some clerical mistake, some coincidence involving another woman with the same name. "This has to be wrong," I said quietly. "There must be another Vanessa." Walter slowly shook his head. "I hoped the same thing when I first saw those records." My eyes dropped back to the paperwork. Bennett Construction had always been Ethan's greatest source of pride. He often told people he had built it with nothing but determination, long hours, and the support of his family. I had believed every word. I had celebrated every contract, every expansion, every award hanging in his office. Yet according to the documents in front of me, nearly 18 months earlier, he had quietly transferred a substantial ownership interest to Vanessa through a newly formed holding company. Why would he do this? I whispered. Walter lowered himself into the leather chair across from me and folded his hands. "That's the question I asked him." I searched his face. "You confronted him?" "About 6 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "I didn't know everything then, but I knew enough to realize he wasn't simply having an affair. He was restructuring his entire future." A chill ran through me. This wasn't an impulsive romance. It was a carefully planned exit. Walter reached for another document near the bottom of the stack. "Look at the dates." I scanned the pages. The ownership transfer had occurred only 3 days after Ethan and I had celebrated our 28th wedding anniversary. The same anniversary during which he had toasted to many more years together while our children applauded around the dinner table. I remembered his speech perfectly. I remembered believing every word. My stomach twisted. "He already knew," I murmured. Even then, he already knew he was leaving me. Walter gave a sorrowful nod. "I'm afraid so." Silence filled the study. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the old oak trees in the backyard. Inside, every memory I possessed seemed to rearrange itself into something darker. Birthdays, vacations, holidays, business trips. Conversations I had once considered ordinary suddenly carried hidden meanings I had never questioned. "There's something else," Walter finally said. I looked at him, exhausted by the possibility that there could be even more. The business transfer wasn't the only thing that concerned me. He slid another folder across the desk. This one contained copies of loan agreements and mortgage documents. Recognize the address? He asked. I immediately recognized it. It was the address of a beautiful lakeside property Ethan had once shown me online. He had laughed and said, "Maybe someday, when we retire." My throat tightened. "What about it?" Walter answered quietly. "The property was purchased 8 months ago." My heartbeat accelerated. Purchased by whom? He didn't need to answer. The ownership documents were already in my hands. Ethan Bennett and Vanessa Cole, joint tenants. I closed my eyes for a moment, because opening them seemed harder than closing them. While I had been planning retirement with my husband, he had apparently been buying another future with someone else. He used company distributions for the down payment, Walter continued. Legally, that may create serious questions depending on how the divorce proceeds. I barely heard the legal explanation. My mind remained trapped on one unbearable image. Ethan walking through that lakeside house with Vanessa, choosing furniture, imagining holidays, discussing sunsets from the porch, all while returning home each evening to sleep beside me. Betrayal wasn't one decision. It was thousands of tiny decisions repeated every day. Walter watched me carefully before speaking again. "Claire, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Do not let guilt convince you to settle quickly." I looked up. "He will probably tell you he wants an amicable divorce. He'll say lawyers only create conflict. He'll insist everyone deserves a fresh start." His expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. "Remember this. A person asking for fairness after months of deception is usually asking to protect themselves, not you." I nodded slowly. For the first time since my marriage had begun unraveling, I felt something besides grief. Not anger, not revenge, clarity. Ethan had spent months planning every financial detail of his departure. I owed it to myself to understand every piece of the truth before signing away the life I had helped build. Just then, Walter's house phone rang from the hallway. He excused himself and stepped out to answer it. Left alone, I glanced once more through the documents until a small folded note slipped from between two pages and landed on the floor. It wasn't attached to any legal filing. It was handwritten in Walter's unmistakable script. Across the top, he had written only one sentence. "If anything happens to me before this is resolved, give this envelope to Claire and no one else." My pulse quickened. Before I could unfold the note completely, Walter returned to the study. He noticed the paper in my hands. His expression changed instantly, and for the first time that evening, the calm old man standing before me looked genuinely alarmed. Walter took 2 slow steps toward me, his eyes fixed on the folded note in my hand. For a brief moment, I thought he might simply take it away without another word. Instead, he closed the study door, drew the curtains, and lowered himself back into his chair with the careful movements of a man carrying more weight than his age alone could explain. "I wasn't planning for you to see that tonight," he said quietly. "But perhaps it's better that you did." I looked down at the handwritten sentence again. "If anything happens to me before this is resolved, give this envelope to Claire and no one else." My voice trembled as I read it aloud. "Walter, what does this mean?" He let out a long breath. "It means I've spent the last several months preparing for possibilities I hoped would never become necessary." My heart began pounding again. "Are you in danger?" He shook his head slowly. "Not the kind of danger you're imagining. I'm an old man, Claire. At my age, every tomorrow is a gift. I simply wanted to make sure the truth wouldn't disappear with me." He reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan and produced a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. He placed it on the desk between us. "Do you recognize this?" I studied it for several seconds before realization dawned on me. "Your safe deposit box," he nodded. "I've kept important family documents there for years. Your wedding certificate, your mother-in-law's jewelry, my original estate planning documents." He paused before adding, "and copies of everything I've discovered about Ethan." I swallowed hard. "Why copies?" Walter looked directly into my eyes. "Because I no longer trust that the originals will always remain where they belong." His answer chilled me. Ethan hadn't simply been hiding an affair. According to his own father, he had become someone capable of concealing financial records and perhaps much more. Walter reached for the note in my hand and carefully unfolded it. Inside was a second sheet containing several names, dates, and one attorney's business card clipped to the corner. "Her name is Margaret Lawson," he explained. "She's been my attorney for nearly 30 years. If something happens to me before I can finish what I've started, she's under strict instructions to contact you." I stared at the card. "Why me?" Walter gave me a sad smile. "Because you're the only person involved in all of this who has never lied to me." Those words settled heavily over the room. For months I had questioned my own judgment, wondering whether I had been naive, whether I had ignored obvious warning signs, whether I somehow deserved what was happening. Hearing Walter place such complete trust in me restored something inside that betrayal had nearly destroyed. "There's one thing I still don't understand," I admitted. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Walter's shoulders sagged. "Because I wanted to believe my son would come to his senses." I confronted him repeatedly. I reminded him of the woman who stood beside him when he had nothing. I reminded him of the family he was risking. Each time he promised he would fix everything. He looked toward the bookshelf, his voice becoming almost reflective. Then one day he stopped promising. He simply said, "Dad, the future belongs to people willing to move forward." Walter looked back at me, disappointment etched across every line of his face. In that moment, I realized he no longer viewed loyalty as something valuable. He viewed it as something inconvenient. A lump formed in my throat. I remembered the young Ethan who once drove across town in a snowstorm just to bring me hot soup when I caught the flu. I remembered the man who held my hand through difficult pregnancies, who cried when our daughter left for college, who once told me success meant nothing if we couldn't celebrate it together. Somewhere along the way, ambition had stopped being a dream and become an appetite that could never be satisfied. Walter interrupted my thoughts. "Claire, I need another promise. Anything. No matter what Ethan says over the next few weeks, don't let sympathy cloud your judgment. There is a difference between forgiving someone and allowing them to rewrite history." I nodded firmly. "I understand." "Good." He slid the brass key toward me. "Keep this." I instinctively pushed it back. "I can't." "Yes, you can." His tone left no room for argument. "If I keep it, Ethan may eventually ask for it. If you keep it, he won't even know where to look." The significance of that statement settled over me slowly. Walter wasn't merely protecting paperwork. He was protecting evidence. Just then, headlights swept across the front windows. Both of us turned toward the sound of tires rolling into the driveway. Walter stood, walked to the edge of the curtain, and looked outside without pulling it back completely. His expression immediately changed. "He's here," he said quietly. My stomach tightened. "Ethan?" Walter nodded once. "And he's not alone." I moved beside him carefully enough to glimpse the driveway through the narrow opening in the curtain. Ethan climbed out of his SUV wearing the confident expression I had known for nearly 3 decades. A second later, the passenger door opened. Vanessa stepped out beside him, smiling as though she belonged there. Before either of them reached the porch, Walter turned toward me and spoke in a calm voice I will never forget. "Claire, whatever happens in the next few minutes, you must not let them know about the safe deposit box." I slipped the brass key into my coat pocket, just as Walter opened the study door. We exchanged one silent look before walking into the hallway together. The front doorbell rang once, followed by a second impatient press. Walter didn't rush. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his glasses, and opened the door with the same quiet dignity I had admired since the day I married into the Bennett family. Ethan smiled the moment he saw his father, but the smile faded when his eyes found me standing several feet behind him. For a brief second, genuine surprise crossed his face. "Claire?" he said. "I didn't know you were here." "That's obvious," I replied calmly. Vanessa stood beside him wearing an elegant cream-colored coat, her hand looped comfortably through Ethan's arm as though she had every right to be there. She looked younger than I remembered from the hotel parking lot, but there was something rehearsed about her smile, as if she had practiced appearing gracious in uncomfortable situations. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," she said politely. Walter didn't return the smile. "My name is Walter," he answered. "You've already met me once under false pretenses. I see no reason to repeat formal introductions." An awkward silence settled over the porch. Ethan cleared his throat. "Dad, can we come in?" Walter stepped aside without saying another word. The four of us moved into the living room, but nobody sat down immediately. The room that had once hosted birthdays, Christmas mornings, and graduation celebrations suddenly felt like a courtroom waiting for opening statements. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Dad, I came because I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot." Walter folded his arms. "The wrong foot was several months ago when you chose deception over honesty." Ethan exhaled slowly, clearly trying to remain composed. "I'm not here to argue." "Then why are you here?" Walter asked. Ethan glanced briefly toward me before answering. "I want everyone to move forward peacefully. Claire and I are going to divorce. It's painful, but it's reality. Dragging this out won't help anyone." I noticed he never once used the word affair. He spoke as though our marriage had simply expired on its own. Walter looked at his son with unmistakable disappointment. "Peace built on lies is not peace, Ethan. It's convenience." Vanessa finally spoke. "Mr. Bennett, I know this is difficult, but Ethan and Claire have both suffered for a long time." I turned toward her. "You know that?" She hesitated. "Ethan told me your marriage had been over emotionally for years." I almost laughed, but the sound never escaped. "Did he also tell you we celebrated our anniversary 3 days before transferring part of his company to you?" Her expression changed instantly. She looked at Ethan. "Transferred what?" The room became perfectly still. Ethan's head snapped toward me. "Claire." It was the first genuine crack in his confidence since he walked through the door. I realized then that Vanessa hadn't known everything. Walter noticed it too. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Apparently there are secrets being kept on more than one side." Vanessa slowly removed her hand from Ethan's arm. "What is she talking about?" Ethan forced a smile that looked painfully artificial. "It's complicated business paperwork." "Business paperwork?" Walter interrupted. "Is that what we're calling hidden ownership transfers now?" Vanessa looked back and forth between all of us, confusion replacing certainty. "Ethan?" she asked again, this time more firmly. "Why would I own part of your company?" Ethan opened his mouth but didn't answer immediately. That hesitation spoke louder than any explanation he could have offered. Walter walked toward the fireplace and rested one hand on the mantel. "I've spent 80 years learning that truth has an interesting habit," he said quietly. "The longer someone buries it, the more people it eventually surprises." Ethan's voice hardened. "Dad, enough." "No," Walter answered. "Enough was the day you decided honesty was optional." For the first time, I saw genuine frustration flash across Ethan's face. He turned toward me. "Claire, whatever Dad has been telling you, he's misunderstanding the situation." "Am I?" I asked softly. "Then explain why Vanessa's name appears beside yours on the ownership documents." Ethan looked at Vanessa again. She had taken 2 slow steps away from him. "You told me you were buying me security in case something happened to you," she whispered. "You never said it came from." She couldn't even finish the sentence. Ethan reached toward her, but she instinctively pulled back. Watching them, I realized something I had never expected. Whatever relationship they had built, it wasn't based on complete honesty either. Walter slowly walked back toward us. "I asked both of you here tonight for one reason," he said. "Not to embarrass anyone, not to choose sides. To give my son one final opportunity to tell the truth." Ethan stared at the floor. Nearly 30 seconds passed without a word. Finally, he looked up. "Some things can't be undone." Walter nodded sadly. "No, they can't." Then he said something none of us expected. "Which is why I met with my attorney this morning." Ethan's eyes widened. "What attorney?" Walter's voice remained perfectly calm. "The one helping me make certain changes before it's too late." For the first time that evening, the confident businessman disappeared completely from Ethan's face. In his place stood a worried son who suddenly understood that his father's next decision might change far more than their relationship. The room fell silent after Walter mentioned his attorney. Ethan's confidence disappeared so quickly that it almost startled me. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I wasn't looking at the polished businessman who always had an answer. I was looking at a little boy who had just realized his father could still surprise him. "Dad," Ethan said carefully, "you're overreacting." Walter didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Am I?" he asked. "Tell me, Ethan, which part is the overreaction? The affair? The hidden ownership transfers? The property you purchased while your wife believed you were planning retirement with her? Or is it the fact that you expected everyone to quietly accept your version of events?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck before answering. "People make mistakes." Walter looked directly into his son's eyes. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something cruel in anger. You didn't make one mistake. You made hundreds of deliberate decisions." Vanessa remained perfectly still beside the sofa. I could almost see her replaying every conversation she and Ethan had ever shared. Finally, she spoke. "Is it true?" Ethan turned toward her. "Vanessa, not now. No." Her voice became firmer. "Now, did you tell me that the company ownership was part of a succession plan because your father wanted you to protect the business?" Ethan hesitated again. That hesitation answered her question before he ever opened his mouth. Vanessa slowly stepped backward. "You lied to me too." Ethan reached toward her. "I simplified things." She stared at him in disbelief. "You simplified a marriage?" Walter quietly shook his head. "Truth has a remarkable way of collecting interest, son. Every lie eventually demands payment." Ethan looked exhausted. "What exactly do you want from me?" Walter answered without hesitation. "Honesty." "Fine." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Yes, I fell in love with someone else. Yes, I should have handled it differently. But I'm trying to move forward instead of living in a marriage that stopped working years ago." I felt every word strike like ice. "Stopped working?" I asked. "When exactly did you decide that? Before or after you asked me to help host your company's anniversary gala? Before or after you stood beside me at Megan's birthday dinner telling everyone how lucky you were? Before or after you promised we'd spend Christmas at the lake once you retired?" Ethan couldn't meet my eyes. Walter answered for him. He decided long before he had the courage to admit it. Another silence settled over us until Walter walked toward the bookshelf and removed a small wooden box. He carried it to the coffee table and carefully opened the lid. Inside were several old photographs. He handed one to Ethan. It showed the two of us standing in front of our first pickup truck, covered in dust after spending an entire weekend delivering construction supplies because we couldn't afford employees. "Remember this day?" Walter asked. Ethan nodded faintly. "Claire drove 6 hours because you couldn't afford another driver. She packed sandwiches so you wouldn't spend money eating out. She believed your dream was her dream." Walter handed him another photograph. "Remember this one?" It showed me holding our newborn son while Ethan signed the papers for his first warehouse. Claire sat alone in a hospital room with a newborn because you were meeting a supplier. She defended that decision to everyone who questioned it. Ethan looked down without speaking. Walter placed the last photograph on top of the others. It was from our 25th anniversary. The entire family surrounded us, laughing. "You know what I see?" Walter asked softly. "I see a woman who invested nearly 30 years into building your life. You seem to see only someone standing in the way of your next chapter." I realized tears were running down my face, but they felt different now. They weren't tears of desperation. They were tears of closure. The illusion I had spent months protecting was finally gone. I no longer needed Ethan to explain himself because nothing he could say would restore what he had willingly destroyed. Walter closed the wooden box and looked at his son one final time. "Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting Margaret Lawson." Ethan immediately stepped forward. "To discuss what?" Walter's answer came without emotion. "My estate." Ethan's expression changed instantly. "Dad!" Walter raised one hand. No, you wanted to build a future based on your own decisions. Tomorrow I will make mine. Ethan took another step. You can't punish me forever because my marriage failed. Walter's eyes hardened. This has nothing to do with your marriage. It has everything to do with your character. No one spoke for several long seconds. Then Walter turned toward me. Claire, would you walk me to the study? I nodded and followed him, leaving Ethan and Vanessa alone in the living room. As soon as Walter closed the study door behind us, he reached into his desk drawer and removed a thick, sealed envelope bearing Margaret Lawson's law firm's letterhead. Across the front, written in bold black ink, were 8 words that immediately stopped my heart. Final will and testament executed this morning. I stared at the sealed envelope without reaching for it. The words final will and testament seemed almost unreal, as though they belonged in someone else's life instead of mine. Walter rested one hand on the desk and watched me carefully. I'm not asking you to open it, he said quietly. Not tonight. I looked up. Then why are you showing it to me? He gave me a tired smile. Because I want you to understand that I made this decision with a clear mind, without pressure, and without regret. I glanced back at the envelope. Does Ethan know? Walter shook his head. He knows I met with Margaret. He doesn't know what I changed. I felt an uneasy knot form in my stomach. He's going to assume the worst. Perhaps, Walter replied. But assumptions are consequences people earn. Before I could answer, raised voices drifted in from the living room. Ethan and Vanessa were arguing. Neither of them seemed to realize how clearly their words carried through the old house. You told me this wouldn't affect your family, Vanessa said, her voice tight with frustration. I told you we'd handle it. Ethan sounded impatient now, nothing like the composed executive everyone admired. Handle it? She shot back. Your father just implied you've been hiding things from me too. Walter closed his eyes for a brief moment. Even now, he whispered, he's still trying to manage the truth instead of telling it. We stepped back into the hallway. The argument stopped immediately when Ethan saw us. Vanessa looked embarrassed, but Ethan recovered quickly. Dad, can we talk privately? Walter answered without hesitation. Nothing said in this house tonight needs to be hidden from Claire. Ethan clenched his jaw. This is family business. Walter's expression never changed. Claire is family, whether you remember that or not. I felt something inside me shift. Only days earlier, hearing those words would have made me cry. Now they gave me strength. Ethan turned toward me. Claire, I never wanted this to become a war. Then why did you prepare for one? I asked calmly. The company, the property, the hidden ownership. Those weren't emotional decisions. They were calculated. He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For the first time, silence betrayed him more effectively than any accusation I could have made. Walter walked to the center of the room. I spent 40 years teaching you that your name was worth more than your bank account, he said. Tonight I realize you remembered only half that lesson. Ethan's frustration finally boiled over. Everything I've built is because I worked for it. Walter nodded slowly. You worked hard. No one denies that. But don't confuse building success with building character. The room fell silent again. Vanessa looked from Walter to Ethan and finally to me. Her expression had changed completely since arriving. The confidence she carried through the front door had disappeared, replaced by uncertainty. Ethan, she asked quietly, did Claire know about the lake house? He didn't answer. Did she? She repeated. No, I answered before he could speak. Vanessa lowered her eyes. I didn't know that. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was the first honest sentence I had heard from her all evening. Walter noticed it too. Truth has a way of freeing people, he said softly. Sometimes from lies, sometimes from the people telling them. Ethan looked exhausted. What happens now? Walter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the front window and looked out into the darkness. Tomorrow morning, Margaret will file the documents we finalized today. After that, my decisions become official. Ethan took a step forward. You're really doing this? Walter turned back slowly. I already did. A heavy silence settled over the room. No one moved. No one seemed willing to breathe too deeply. Then Walter looked directly at me. Claire, I'd like you to come with me tomorrow. I frowned. To your attorney's office? Yes. Ethan immediately interrupted. Why would she be there? Walter's answer came without hesitation. Because there are certain conversations I want her to hear firsthand. Ethan's face lost what little color remained. Dad, what exactly is in that will? Walter held his gaze for several long seconds before speaking. You'll find out soon enough. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed a small sealed envelope, and placed it in my hands. Written across the front in his unmistakable handwriting were 6 words that made my heart skip a beat. Open only after tomorrow's meeting. I barely slept that night. Walter's sealed envelope rested on my kitchen table exactly where I had left it, and every instinct urged me to open it despite the instructions written across the front. More than once I reached for it only to pull my hand away. If Walter had trusted me enough to wait, I owed him that respect. By 9 o'clock the following morning, I was sitting beside him in Margaret Lawson's office, a quiet room lined with shelves of legal books and framed family photographs that somehow made the conversation feel even heavier. Margaret greeted Walter warmly before turning to me with kind but serious eyes. Claire, she said, Walter has spoken very highly of you for many years. I thanked her quietly, unsure why I had been invited. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later without Vanessa. The moment he walked through the door, he looked from me to Walter and then to Margaret. Dad, I still don't understand why she's here, Walter answered calmly. Because the truth affects more than one person. Margaret waited until everyone was seated before opening a thick leather folder. Mr. Bennett has asked me to explain the changes he executed yesterday while he is present and fully competent. Ethan leaned forward immediately. Changes to what? Walter folded his hands. To my estate plan. Margaret removed several signed documents and continued. Your father has updated his will, revised several beneficiary designations, and established a charitable trust. Ethan's face remained unreadable. That's your decision. Walter nodded. It is. Margaret continued reading. She explained that Walter's personal savings would largely support scholarships for students entering vocational trades, something he had discussed for years. She explained that several family heirlooms would pass directly to his grandchildren. Ethan listened patiently, almost relieved. Then Margaret reached the final section. She looked up briefly before reading aloud. The remainder of the estate, including Mr. Bennett's ownership interest in Bennett Construction, shall pass according to the provisions outlined in Article 9. Ethan straightened in his chair. Walter looked at him quietly but said nothing. Margaret turned the page. Mr. Ethan Bennett shall retain only those interests already legally owned by him at the time of my death. My remaining ownership interest in Bennett Construction shall not transfer to Ethan Bennett. The room became perfectly silent. Ethan blinked once, clearly believing he had misunderstood. Excuse me? Margaret calmly continued. Instead, Mr. Bennett's ownership interest shall be transferred into a trust managed independently for the benefit of my grandchildren, with Claire Bennett appointed as the initial independent trustee until the youngest beneficiary reaches the age specified in the trust agreement. Ethan stared at his father. Claire? His voice cracked with disbelief. You're putting my ex-wife in charge of the company? Walter answered with remarkable calm. I'm placing it in the hands of the only adult in this room who has consistently demonstrated loyalty without asking what she would receive in return. Ethan pushed his chair back so abruptly it scraped across the hardwood floor. This is insane. Margaret remained composed. Please sit down, Mr. Bennett. He ignored her. Dad, she's not even involved in the business. Walter nodded once. Neither were you when Claire worked 2 jobs to keep it alive. Ethan looked as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. Walter continued before he could recover. This is not revenge. If I wanted revenge, I would have sold everything. This is accountability. My grandchildren deserve to inherit a business governed by integrity, not secrecy. I sat frozen. I had never expected Walter to mention my name, much less place such enormous responsibility on my shoulders. Walter, I whispered, I never asked for this. He smiled gently. Exactly. Ethan turned toward me. For the first time since our marriage began falling apart, there was no arrogance in his face, only desperation. Claire, tell him this is unnecessary. I met his eyes. You spent months making decisions without asking what I thought. This decision belongs to your father. Ethan closed his eyes briefly before looking back at Walter. You're destroying everything I built. Walter answered softly. No, son. I am protecting what your mother, Claire. And I helped you build before you forgot where it came from. Another heavy silence settled over the office. Margaret quietly organized the signed papers while Ethan remained standing, unable to speak. I suddenly remembered the second envelope Walter had given me the previous evening. Walter, I said, reaching into my purse, you told me to open this after today's meeting. He nodded. Go ahead. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. I unfolded it slowly and read the first line aloud without meaning to. If you are reading this, then Ethan has finally learned only half of what I decided yesterday. My heart skipped a beat. I looked up at Walter in confusion. He gave me the faintest smile and said, Turn the page. That's the part no one here knows yet. My hands trembled as I turned the page. The room was so quiet that I could hear the paper moving between my fingers. Walter watched me with calm eyes while Ethan remained standing, still trying to process everything he had already lost. I lowered my eyes to the letter and began reading. Claire, if you are reading this, then you have already learned that I changed my will. But this letter is not about money. It is about something far more valuable. Throughout my life, I have learned that wealth can build houses, companies, and reputations, but only character builds a family. I have watched you prove your character every year since you married my son. You stood beside him when success was only an idea. You protected our family without asking for recognition. You remained loyal even when loyalty was no longer returned. Whatever happens after I am gone, I do not want you to mistake my legal decisions for an attempt to reward you. They are my final attempt to protect the values I hope my grandchildren will someday inherit. I stopped reading for a moment because my vision had blurred with tears. Walter smiled gently. Finish it. I nodded and continued. Ethan, if you are hearing these words, know that I have never stopped loving you. A father does not stop loving his child because of failure. But love without accountability becomes permission, and I refuse to give you permission to become a man who believes betrayal carries no consequences. If one day you truly earn forgiveness, it will not come because of money or inheritance. It will come because your actions finally deserve it. When I reached the end of the letter, no one spoke. Even Ethan seemed unable to find words. His shoulders, once always squared with confidence, now sagged beneath a weight that had nothing to do with business or property. Walter quietly folded his hands. That is everything I wanted to say. Ethan looked at his father for a long time before speaking. You really think I've become that kind of man? Walter answered honestly. No. I think you became that man one choice at a time. The good news is that people can also become better one choice at a time. For the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan didn't argue. He simply lowered his head. I'm sorry, he whispered. I had imagined hearing those words countless times during sleepless nights, believing they would somehow repair what had been broken. They didn't. They couldn't. They were simply words arriving months too late. Ethan slowly turned toward me. Claire, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect understanding. But I am sorry for what I did to you. I studied the face I had loved for nearly 3 decades. The anger inside me had quietly disappeared sometime during the past few weeks. In its place was something far calmer: acceptance. I believe you're sorry, I answered softly. I just don't believe you're sorry for the same reasons I was hurt. He nodded once because he knew I was right. Margaret closed the file on her desk, signaling that the meeting had officially ended. As we walked toward the parking lot, Walter reached for my arm. Would you do me one favor? He asked. Anything. Keep living your life. Don't spend it trying to prove anything to people who stopped appreciating you long ago. I smiled through tears. I will. The divorce was finalized several months later. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. The financial records eventually told the same story Walter had suspected all along, and every legal decision was based on facts instead of deception. Bennett Construction continued operating under the trust exactly as Walter intended, with professional managers handling daily operations, while I fulfilled my responsibilities as trustee for our grandchildren. I never treated it as a victory because it wasn't. Families don't truly win when trust is destroyed. Vanessa quietly left Ethan less than a year later. As it turned out, relationships built on hidden truths rarely survive once every secret reaches the light. I heard she moved to another state to begin again. I genuinely wished her peace. Carrying bitterness would only have chained me to a chapter that was already over. Ethan and I eventually learned how to speak politely at birthdays, graduations, and family holidays. We would never be friends, but we became two people capable of placing our grandchildren above our shared history. Surprisingly, that was enough. Walter passed away peacefully almost 3 years later. At his memorial service, people spoke about his fairness, his wisdom, and the quiet strength with which he lived his life. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't mention the will, the company, or the inheritance. I simply told everyone the greatest lesson he ever taught me. A person's true legacy isn't measured by what they leave behind. It's measured by the courage they show when doing the right thing becomes difficult. Sometimes people ask whether I regret giving nearly 30 years of my life to a marriage that ended in betrayal. My answer always surprises them. No, I don't regret loving honestly. I don't regret believing in someone when they had nothing. Those choices shaped my character, not my failure. Ethan's choices shaped his. We are all responsible for the lives we build, but even more responsible for the people we become while building them. I lost the marriage I thought would last forever. I lost the future I had carefully planned, but I discovered something far more valuable than either of those things. I discovered that dignity cannot be taken away by betrayal unless we willingly surrender it. And that, more than any inheritance, became the greatest gift Walter ever left me.